Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros, helping students succeed in all kinds of tests from eighth grade to grad school in Cleveland, Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Try It Learning, helping students with tests, school, and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 50 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and college admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is what is the SHSAT? But first, let's meet our special guest, Kenny Tan.
Kenny Tan is the son of Chinese immigrants and graduated from Stuyvesant High School in New York City. He received his BA in economics from Vanderbilt University. Kenny has been working in test prep since 2010. He founded Kenny Tan Test Prep to empower students with the grit, resilience, and curiosity necessary for a successful academic and professional career. He specializes in the SHSAT, IC, SSAT, SAT, and ACT. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Mike and Amy.
Great to see you, Kenny. It's always a pleasure to get together with you, and it's a pleasure to talk shop, particularly the test we're going to cover, the SHSAT. Before we get into that, I'd love to know a bit about your background. Obviously, we did a full test prep profile with you in episode 154, but maybe not everybody listened or forgot. So how about a 4 or 5 minute refresher on who Kenny Tan is?
Sure. So I started my test prep journey when I was actually still in high school, when I was a senior. After I had finished taking the SAT, the local learning center where I had taken my prep classes with hired me to be an instructor, and I taught classes for the SAT and SHSAT. After college, I wasn't exactly enthusiastic about picking up a regular 9 to 5 job, so I decided to go into tutoring as a way to actually save up money to pay for flying lessons. So my original plan was to become an airline pilot. I ended up getting my private pilot's license a couple years ago. I still enjoy it as a hobby, but my real passion right now is tutoring.
So you've given up on the dream of becoming a professional airline pilot, or you're deferring it?
I think I'm deferring it.
Hey, I want to know about the pathway from economics to flying airplanes. So you
Oh,
were an
well,
economics major?
I was an economics major. My original major was computer science. I decided to switch majors about sophomore year of college. Econ turned out to be better suited to my abilities. We'll just say that.
That's very interesting. I mean, just economics itself, very interesting path for a person to take. But now you're deep into test prep and you don't focus on a specific test, do you? You actually help students with all different kinds of tests.
That's right. Most of my students are SHSAT students. I also have some overlap between them and the IC and SSAT. The IC and SSAT are those private high school entrance exams. And then I have many students who come back to me after a couple of years for SAT and ACT help.
That's great. Now, have you had anybody do the leapfrog from high school admissions to college admissions and then come back and ask for graduate admissions?
Not yet, but I've been doing the tutoring since 2014, so I suppose now is about the time when the first couple of people I tutored are graduating.
That's exactly how it works, Kenny. It literally works that way. Yeah, we've got a student and actually a brother now where I had worked with the father years ago. So it is funny how that you stay in the business long enough and you're going to work your way all the way through the
That's funny.
family
Amy, did
line.
you just say you're working with somebody who you worked with as father?
I did. I know. Yeah,
Wow,
I
that
know.
is
Crazy. When I told
that's
the
not
mom,
going
I'm
to happen
like,
to Kenny anytime soon.
I know you got a little. I got a few years on you, Kenny. So that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying my best to maintain those relationships after we conclude the tutoring sessions. I try to stay in touch with them by phone, email, and I also make it a point to build strong relationships with my families. I remember one family that invited me out to the local botanical garden with them just on a field trip, and they ended up buying me a membership. I have other families who, invite me to stay for dinner when I'm tutoring. So yeah, it's more than just providing a service. It's really providing mentorship to my students, and at the same time, really getting to know my clients' interests and figuring out ways to help them in all sorts of all different aspects of their life.
Perfect.
That's wonderful.
So you specialize in ASET, SHSAT. And it's possible that many listeners don't even know what the SHSAT is. Can you let us know what that test is and who requires it?
Sure. So the specialized high school admission test in New York City is open to 8th and ninth grade students across the 5 boroughs. In a normal year, about 30,000 students take the test, and most of those students are 8th grade students.
Funny, about 30,000. I think roughly 80,000 take the GRE.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the SHSAT is a big test.
Yeah, I never heard of it, obviously in Cleveland, Ohio. I'd never heard of it until I met all of you test prep peeps and, those who hearken from
In
the
New
New York
York City
City.
Metro
They are the ones who are
people.
always talking about it, right? Right. Um, so tell us a little bit about the SHSAT in terms of what does it actually cover?
Sure. So the SHSAT, it used to have scrambled paragraph and logical reasoning questions, which they've now gotten rid of as of a few years ago. The current incarnation of the test is 114 questions, which students have 3 hours to complete. Half of the test is English language arts, and the other half is mathematics. So on the ELA side, there are between 9 to 19 questions that are revising and editing questions, which are meant to assess students' ability to recognize and correct language errors and improve the overall quality of writing. That section is split up into 2 parts as well. There's the revising and editing sentences and paragraphs, and then there's revising and editing passages. So that is pretty similar to what you see on the SAT and ACT writing and language portion or the ACT English portion.
How do
Um,
students fare with time? How do they usually do, like with the amount of questions you're talking about, the amount of time they
so
have?
that's a great question because on the SHSAT, students get to choose how they spend their time between the 2 sections. They can decide to start the math section and then do the English section, or they can start with the English section and then do the math section. So with the full 3 hours, they can jump back and forth between the 2 sections. Um, given the 3 hours and the 114 questions, that comes out to about a minute and a half per question. But with pretty much all my students, they tend to be better at one section or the other. So with regards to pacing, it's really something that it's a skill that they uh, really pick up through the tutoring and the practice tests that we do together.
So that's
Now,
interesting. Are you guys familiar with any other tests where students get to pick among sections? I don't think I've ever, in my experience with tests, usually it's you do the section, you can only work on this section, you cannot move on. But to my knowledge, this might be the only test I know of where it sounds like that is not the case.
Yeah, I think the SHSAT is the only test that comes to mind where students get to jump back and forth between sections.
but it's a paper and pencil test, right?
Yes, it is.
So does that factor in your strategy with your students where they should start, where they should focus their time at all?
Well, I recommend that students start with the section that they find easiest and then use that sort of as a warm up for the hardest questions.
I would agree.
So the math side of the SHSAT tests what level of math, and is there the kind of focus on word problems that you see in most standardized tests?
Yes, so there is definitely a focus on word problems on the math side. The content is supposed to be 6th and 7th grade level mathematics, although I find that there's a little bit of algebra as well, basic algebra. Um, and the content tends to be more challenging than what the typical 8th grade student is learning in school. So students who are taking accelerated classes tend to be the best at handling the questions on the test. The format of the math questions is also similar to the SAT. There are grid-in questions, five grid-in questions, and then 52 multiple choice questions.
Now, um, you can tell I'm unfamiliar with the SHSAT. When you were talking about the English side, you spoke about the grammar. Are there any reading questions? Is there any kind of
Yes,
reading
yes, there are.
comprehension? Okay.
There's between 38 to 48 reading comprehension questions on each version of the test. And that's split up between 5 to 6 passages. The passages can be fiction and nonfiction. They actually added the fiction passages just a few years ago, and that includes usually one poem as well.
Oh,
One poem, kind of like the old SAT 2 subject test, right? Or didn't that have like the lit? Didn't that have a poem?
yeah. Do you have to
Yeah.
delve into some like similes and metaphors or figurative language with that? I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. Inferences, similes, metaphors, figurative language.
The suite of rhetorical devices.
Mhm.
Yes, and all your typical reading comprehension questions along the way.
Now, most tests kind of at this level will often delve into vocabulary where students have to possibly study lots of words, unlike, right, the SAT that we know today that we might not have to do that. But do you find with the SHSAT, too many letters for me, do you find that you have to do much with vocabulary for that test?
You know, occasionally there is challenging vocabulary in the passages, but usually there are footnotes provided at the end of the passage that help students understand any unfamiliar words. There aren't actually many vocabulary and context questions on the SHSAT, at least no questions where the answer choices will simply be synonyms.
Hmm.
Okay. So it's this test doesn't focus on vocabulary the way some other tests do.
That's right.
Yeah, because most of the other admissions tests that I know for high school, they do really delve into vocabulary, like the IC or the HSPT or SSAT. There's a lot of heavy duty vocabulary on those tests, but not so much on this test.
That's right. Yes. So that's definitely a big difference between the SHSAT and those private high school entrance tests.
Now, do you
What are
see
some
many?
other different what are some other differences? You mentioned the timing, like kind of the structure of the timing. How else do these tests differ? Just in case a student was preparing for more than one, say a student is preparing for the IC for private school, SHSAT for a specialized high school, still doesn't know which way they're going to go.
Sure. Yeah. So the SHSAT is all basically multiple choice slash grading questions, whereas with the IC and the SSAT, there's an additional essay portion, which is not graded but still submitted to the schools. And the math section of the IC is definitely more challenging than the math section of the SHSAT. With the IC, there's additional topics such as trigonometry. Um, the reading comprehension actually is pretty similar. In fact, there's sometimes poetry in the SSAT, so that's one overlap between that and the SHSAT. And like we said, there's a lot of vocabulary that you have to memorize for the IC and the SSAT, synonyms, sentence completions, analogies, and you don't see any of that on the SHSAT.
Now, I'm curious in New York City, do you find that some of your students are prepping for more than one test at a time? Or is it generally like, no, I have students and they're just focused on the SHSAT?
Well, over the past year, I definitely came across a lot of students who were preparing for more than one test at a time. I think that was mostly because of the vast amount of uncertainty regarding high school admissions due to COVID. There were a lot of deadlines that got postponed, pushed back. The test dates got postponed, and parents were really unsure about which high school they would be able to get their children into.
What is the typical timeline for the test as far as in a normal year cycle? What would be sort of when students are taking the test or when they get results back, or what's that kind of process like?
Sure. So in a normal year, the SHSAT is usually administered beginning in the last weekend of October. And then there are some additional test dates in November that are for ninth grade students who are taking it, and students with disabilities that take it on a different date. Last year, the test was supposed to begin administration the first weekend of November, and that got pushed back all the way till the end of January.
Mhm.
And in fact, there are some students that still are planning to take it this summer. So that's because some students, due to illness related to COVID, they may not have been able to take the SHSAT a few months ago, they'll still be offered the opportunity to take it this summer.
Now, once students take the test, I'm assuming they can only take it one time. Would
That's
that
right.
be okay? So, unlike some of the other entrance exams for high school, you might be able to test multiple times. This is a one and done. How long does it generally take for families to get the results of the exam back?
Well, it usually takes quite a while. In a normal year, after students take the test in October or November, they don't get the results back until March. And then this past year, I believe students didn't get their results back until May.
And then
Now,
what?
the the whole idea of a test that has so many students taking it for a handful of schools that most people in the United States don't even know might be difficult without the context of knowing which schools we're talking about. And out of that pool of roughly 30,000 students, how many seats are available? Can you tell us a bit about the schools and the competitive nature of this admissions process?
Sure. So I can give you the numbers for this past year. And of course, this past year was slightly different because there were fewer students taking the test due to the pandemic. I suppose there was less interest in sitting down in person. Um, so there were 23,528 students that took it this past year. Out of those, 4,262 offers were made to students. That comes out to about 18% of students who took the test ended up receiving an offer of admission. Um, and about 20% of seats are also reserved for the Discovery Program, which is a program that the Department of Education offers to students who attend schools that are have a low socioeconomic status, and basically students who score below the cutoff score for any of the specialized high schools, if they score just below the cutoff score, they're offered the opportunity to complete a sort of summer school program. And after the completion of that program, they're allowed to um, enter one of these specialized high schools as well.
Which
So,
schools are we talking about?
So all of the specialized high schools have or participate in the Discovery Program.
No, I know, but what are the specialized high schools?
Yes.
Again, I'm from New York. You're from New York. What schools are we talking about?
inform me, please.
So that would be Stuyvesant High School is the most prestigious of the specialized high schools, followed by Bronx Science, Brooklyn Technical High School, the High School for Mathematics, Science, and Engineering at City College, High School of American Studies at Lehman College, Queens High School for the Sciences at York College, Staten Island Technical High School, and Brooklyn Latin School.
Would it be fair to say that these are some of the most top rated public high schools in the nation?
Absolutely. And these are some of the most competitive public high schools to get into at anywhere um, relative to anywhere in the country.
Right. I mean, there are a couple of other specialized public high schools like TJ. There's a
TJ,
big
right.
discussion about that. But for the most part, New York City really has uh, a unique public school system. And the 18% admit rate based on the test, when the students that take the test are self-selecting anyway, puts them right up there in the highly selective conversation we usually reserve for very competitive colleges, right, Kenny?
Absolutely, that's right.
I want to talk real quickly about, those students that get offers. Do you have any sense of what type of quote unquote score would be considered passing
Yes.
to be offered admission?
So to get into the most selective of the specialized high schools, meaning Stuyvesant High School, students need to get about 90% or more of the questions correct. And then the least selective of all the specialized high schools, meaning Brooklyn Tech and Brooklyn Latin, students will still need to get about 75% or more of the questions correct. It's also interesting how exactly the test is scored because the ELA and the math sections are scored separately, and then each raw score is converted into a scaled score using a specific scoring curve. the scaled scores and that are then summed together to arrive at the total score, which is usually maxing out around 700 points.
So is there like a, we usually talk about percentiles, but is there a sort of a score range that students would get that's kind of on a scale? Like the
So we
SAT is like, between out of 800 or whatever.
so the SHSAT is out of about 700.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the Department of Education has never published the percentile table. So we don't exactly know how a scaled score compares to a percentile. But what's interesting about the scoring curve on the SHSAT is that if you get 60% correct on one section and then maybe 100% correct on the other section, you'll end up getting a higher total score than if you got 80% correct in both sections. And that's because in the middle of the score range, each extra question that you get correct might be worth only about 4 points. But as you get closer and closer to that perfect raw score, each extra question you get correct is worth more, around 12 points.
So as a test prep tutor, Kenny, does that influence how you train your students or how you teach your students to work with the test?
That definitely does. And there are some students who are already doing really well in one subject, in which case I would encourage them to leverage their strengths and try to achieve that perfect score, which would be 57 out of 57 questions correct in a single section. And also what's interesting about the questions on the SHSAT is there are experimental questions that are hidden in the test.
Ah.
There are 10 experimental questions in each section, and students are theoretically not supposed to be able to tell them apart from the actual questions that will be scored.
Theoretically,
Interesting.
Yes.
does that, can a trained, prepared student often identify the experimental items?
Well, I've never had a student tell me exactly that they were able to spot a question that definitely didn't belong. But I suppose a trained professional taking the test would probably be able to tell if a question was too difficult or too easy.
Yeah, but that doesn't happen. You can't. It's not like people who well into adulthood take the SAT or ACT. You probably can't get a seat at an
That,
SHSAT, can you?
that's right. As an adult, you just can't sit for the test. Although there is a tiny caveat I would add to that, which is students who take the test are offered the opportunity to review their answers after they get their scores back, but you have to write to the Department of Education to set up an appointment. And then once you get the appointment, the student, along with the parent or guardian, can go in and actually look at the test. They won't be able to make copies of it, obviously, or take it away
Oh,
out of the,
right.
won't be able
So
to take
that
it out.
guardian,
Yeah,
I would love to see the legal paperwork signing a test prep tutor as a
They get
guardian,
into a
at least
room,
temporarily.
that's
locked
right.
room with a lockbox.
So I have heard of other tutors who will actually go in there with their students, and if it was a student who just scored right below the cutoff, they might be able to find one or two questions that are debatable, and in which case they can file an appeal and maybe get some extra points added, and in which case they might just be able to get into a school that they otherwise didn't.
That's very cool.
Very interesting. Yeah. So generally then students are and tutors are not do not get access to these tests. They're not released like annually or anything like that. It's more like you said, if you have to really work for it if you want
That's
to have
right,
access to the
absolutely.
copy.
There are practice tests that are published by the New York City Department of Education, although those tests are heavily recycled, meaning it tends to be the same two practice tests published every year in the handbook.
Sure.
Interesting. Listen, I know that we could talk about the SHSAT all day. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Kenny, for joining us today.
You're welcome, Mike and Amy.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way to find my contact information is at my website, which is kennytan.nyc.
Awesome. We hope you enjoy this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.